In November 1932, Australia did something almost unbelievable. A country that had just fought in World War I. A country with battle-hardened soldiers and machine guns at the ready declared war. Not against another nation, not against a rebellion, but against birds, specifically emus. Yes, the large, flightless, goofy-looking birds that resemble ostriches. Australia declared war on them. And here's the kicker: the birds won. The farmers' problem to understand how this ridiculous war started, we need to rewind to the early 1930s. Australia was deep in the Great Depression. Farmers in Western Australia were struggling to grow wheat. Prices collapsed, and many veterans of World War I, who had been given farmland as part of their resettlement, were barely hanging on. Then came the emus. Every year, thousands of emus migrated inland after breeding season, moving in huge flocks through the countryside. In late 1932, about 20,000 of them decided to march straight through the farmers' wheat fields. To a desperate farmer, it looked like an invasion. The emus trampled fences, devoured crops, and created chaos in fields already on the brink of failure. Farmers begged the government for help, but they didn't want better fences or subsidies. They wanted soldiers. The government's plan, the farmers argued that since the government had trained men for war, why not deploy them against the birds? After all, they had no shortage of veterans who knew how to handle machine guns. Incredibly, the government agreed. Defense Minister Sir George Pearce authorized a military operation. The mission: send soldiers with Lewis machine guns to Western Australia and wipe out the emus. It sounds like satire, but it's in the records. 3 soldiers were dispatched, including Major G.P.W. Meredith, armed with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Farmers watched eagerly. This was going to be a slaughter. Except it wasn't. The first confrontation, took place near the town of Campion in late November. A group of about 50 emus was spotted. The soldiers crept into position, mounted their Lewis gun, and opened fire. The birds scattered immediately. The gun jammed after only a few kills. The rest of the emus sprinted off at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. The farmers stood dumbfounded. Somehow, the soldiers, trained to mow down enemy troops in World War I, had just been outmaneuvered by a flock of birds. The emus fight back over the next several days. The soldiers kept trying, but the emus proved far more difficult targets than anyone expected. They traveled in small groups, with what looked like a natural chain of command. Farmers joked that one leader bird would act as lookout, directing the others. When the machine guns opened up, the leader would signal, and the flock would scatter in different directions. Major Meredith himself later admitted, if we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. In other words, the emus weren't just surviving, they were winning. The humiliation at one point, the soldiers set up an ambush near a dam where hundreds of emus were drinking. Perfect target, but when they opened fire, the Lewis gun jammed almost immediately. The birds fled, hardly any were killed, and the operation turned into a farce. Even when the guns did work, the birds simply outran the bullets. Emus are fast, reaching speeds of 30 miles per hour, and they zigzagged unpredictably across the fields. The soldiers admitted that even with machine guns, it was like trying to hit ghosts. By the end of the first week, the military had fired thousands of rounds. The body count? A few dozen birds. The rest were alive and well, continuing to feast on wheat. Public embarrassment word of the war spread quickly, and the press had a field day. Newspapers mocked the operation, painting it as the most absurd military campaign in history. Cartoons depicted emus wearing medals, standing victorious over retreating soldiers. Farmers grew frustrated. Instead of protecting their crops, the government had launched a military circus. And every failed mission only made the soldiers and the politicians who sent them look more ridiculous. By December, it was obvious the Emu War wasn't working. The army was losing. Closing of Section 1, so by the end of 1932, the situation was surreal. Australia had deployed machine guns, veterans, and thousands of bullets against birds, and lost. The emus outran, outmaneuvered, and outright humiliated the soldiers sent to destroy them. But this was only the first half of the story. In Section 2, we'll see how the government tried again, how the emus continued to defy them, and how the war officially ended with a bird victory that left Australia embarrassed for decades. Because the strangest thing isn't just that Australia went to war with birds, it's that the birds won. By early December 1932, the Emu War had become a running joke. The government had sent soldiers with machine guns to Western Australia, and the emus had not only survived, they'd thrived. But the story wasn't over. Determined not to lose face, the military launched more operations. What followed was a bizarre campaign that only deepened the humiliation. Phase 2 of the war after the initial failures. Major Meredith regrouped his men. He adjusted tactics, moved locations, and tried to ambush the birds at watering holes. This time, the soldiers managed to kill more. In one encounter, they claimed nearly 100 emus in a day. But the numbers were still pitiful compared to the flocks of thousands roaming the countryside. The emus kept dodging, scattering, and running faster than the guns could fire. Ammunition ran low. Farmers grew angry. The operation was starting to look less like a war and more like a very expensive goose chase. Except with emus. The final numbers by mid-December, the military had fired over 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Official records say fewer than 1,000 emus were killed. That meant it took roughly 10 bullets to kill one bird, a terrible return for a professional army. The rest of the birds, some 19,000 of them, remained very much alive, still raiding wheat fields, still trampling fences, still making fools of the soldiers. The government quietly withdrew the troops. The Emu War was over, and the birds had won. The aftermath in the press, when news hit the papers, the ridicule was brutal. Headlines called it Australia's most absurd war. Political cartoonists drew emus standing on piles of ammunition, mocking soldiers. Farmers grumbled that the government had wasted time and resources. Major Meredith himself offered the most unintentionally hilarious tribute. He admitted that the emus had proved almost impossible to kill, praising their speed, stamina, and uncanny ability to dodge bullets. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks, he said. That's right. The man sent to destroy them compared emus to tanks, and the tanks had won. The government solution embarrassed by the failure. The government looked for alternatives. They didn't try another war. Instead, they funded bounty programs, paying farmers to kill emus themselves. Later, they built long stretches of emu-proof fencing to keep the birds out of farmland. That worked better than soldiers with guns. But the memory of the Emu War lingered. The birds' victory, the emus didn't just survive, they flourished. Their population remained strong, and to this day, emus are common across Australia. Meanwhile, the Emu War became legend, a reminder that sometimes nature doesn't just resist humans, it humiliates them. The legacy of the Emu War quickly entered folklore. Australians joked about decorating emus with medals for bravery. Decades later, comedians, historians, and internet meme makers would rediscover the story, laughing at the image of soldiers retreating from a bird army. It wasn't just a funny story, though. It revealed something deeper: how governments can overreact, how technology can fail in absurd ways, and how human arrogance can be brought low by something as simple as a flightless bird. And in the age of the internet, the Great Emu War became the perfect meme. A true story so ridiculous it sounds fake. So here's the final tally. Australia declared war on emus. They sent soldiers with machine guns. They fired over 10,000 rounds of ammunition. And in the end, the emus won. It remains one of history's strangest military campaigns, a war with no real battles, no treaties, and no human casualties. Only birds running free across the outback, victorious against the might of modern weaponry. The Emu War of 1932 wasn't just a fiasco. It was proof that sometimes No matter how powerful we think we are, nature has the